Hi, Chris. Welcome.
Hello, hello, hello.
It's such a pleasure to be able to interview you and to find out about your journey. So part of these interviews is about people's individual practice journey
hmm
and what works for them. So I'm curious to learn more about you and what started you on the journey.
Yes, well now talking about this will show my age, but I'm lately thinking age is more about wisdom, right? It's not
Yep.
about age, it's about wisdom. So really my first little glimpse of anything related to meditation or mindfulness was back in the 70s. I started my career as an oncology nurse. And this was in the era where literally we just began talking about mind body connection. It seems crazy now to think about it back then, but since I was working with cancer patients, this is when several specialists started coming up with visualizations for cancer patients to do when they were going through treatment, et cetera, to help manage their symptoms and manage their overall, ability to navigate the cancer journey. So I had the experience of doing some of that, and I was intrigued by it, and probably then through the 80s continued to do things that were more along that line, guided visualization, affirmations, things like that. And then in the 90s, I took a coaching course that was almost a year long. And one of the things they had us do as part of our routine in that course, they didn't call it mindfulness or meditation. They didn't even call it just sitting. But now I know from what I know about Zen, we could call it just sitting or choiceless awareness. So they just had us 5 minutes every day, just sit and notice what we notice. And I was blown away by the simplicity of that, um, and and just how much it seemed to be changing my experience of myself and the world.
So
And
what
then
was going,
oh, go ahead, go
sorry,
ahead.
yeah, what was going on for you for in those kind of practices? Because I can imagine for some people, um, they've got a lot of monkey mind, they don't really know what they're doing. So what was unique about that experience for you?
Well, I think part of it was just what you said. It was the realization, the meeting of monkey mind, the noticing that, wow, there's all kinds of stuff going on in my head and in my body. And I don't even know if I knew the term monkey mind at that time, but I was intrigued by it rather than feeling distracted by it or disappointed or discouraged by how much was going on. I was more fascinated, like, wow, who knew? Who knew this whole movie was going on inside my body and inside my mind? And then it got me curious about how did that impact how I was showing up every day?
Mhm. And so you mentioned so previously you did a lot of visualizations um, and affirmations. So was that already part of your interest in terms of the positive psychology, those aspects?
It was at that time, although I have to say, since I've been practicing unified mindfulness now for 15 years, it's probably lower on my list of priority because I feel more intrigued by some of the other experiences that we can have through the various techniques that we have in unified mindfulness. But yeah, I would say early on, it was a way that kind of hooked me and got me
Yeah.
interested.
And then how did you come across Shenzhen then?
Yes, yes. So I was living in Colorado at the time, and a good friend of mine worked at Sounds True, who produced his audio tapes and CD packages and published his book as well. And she she said, "Hey, I've got a bunch of stuff that got returned to the warehouse. If you're interested, take a look and see if there's anything you want." And to be honest, the first thing that drew me to Shinzen's package was the big sunflower on his literal audio tapes, not CDs. They were the tape
Yeah.
package. But I just thought, oh, this is really intriguing, and the whole title, Science of Enlightenment. So I started listening to it and kind of vacillated between this guy. I really understand him, and I don't have a clue what this guy is saying. And 15 years later, I'm still there. It's like, I really get it. I don't get it.
So
So
did
that was my first exposure to Shinzen, and then shortly thereafter, I got the opportunity to do just a weekend retreat with him in Colorado, and then I was sold. I was just
okay.
sold then.
I know we met in one of the retreats. So were there certain experiences, or was it that happened during retreats or in practice, or was it more of an arc that you noticed of the benefits?
Yeah, yeah. For me, it was definitely that arc, I think, because at the time when I met Shenzhen in that retreat in 2008, he was just really getting the home practice program going, the, once a month weekend. And that was such perfect timing because he really was stressing there's got to be a way. Now this was way before Zoom and all these other things, right? He would stress there's got to be a way to help people who can't go to retreat, either can't travel, can't afford it, whatever, to help them grow their practice. So I took that seriously and became a devotee beyond beyond the beyond with home practice, and probably did not miss a home practice weekend. Well, I don't know, for a very, very long time. I just continued to chip away, even though I wasn't doing that much retreating, maybe just once every couple years. So, but he continued to validate for me that even through the home practice program experience, routinely once a month, that he could really see the progress in my practice, and so could I. So that was very cool.
And what would you say were those notices that you mentioned
Well,
in your
some of the typical ones were that I was less resistant to my practice and more looking forward to it. That I was able to extend the time that I could stay focused and concentrated in practice, and then starting to notice the impact in my life, the um, feeling calmer, feeling more balanced, feeling less reactive. There were just many, many things that I was noticing in sometimes some subtle ways, but sometimes some really significant ways to say, I think something's changing in me.
And were there other insights that came with that, Chris?
Um, I think one of the biggest for me was the idea of, well, let me jump back a little bit. Anything that I had read prior to Shinzen that talked about no self or dismantling the ego or things like that felt really confusing to me. It's like, what? How can you do that? I am a self. Like, here I am. Like, what do you mean, no self? But it was his explanation that finally got me to, I like the word disidentify. I don't know that I could say that I really have let go of the ego. As a matter of fact, I know I haven't. But I'm so less identified with it. And by ego, what I mean is I'm less identified with needing things to be a certain way. A grippiness, a craving of like, it's got to be this way or else I suffer or someone else has to suffer. So I felt like it brought so much more spaciousness to how I experience things and approach things.
Wow. Um, and was that a gradual process as well, Chris, or?
Yeah, I would say given what I described about doing the monthly home practice program, I don't really remember a particular time either in a home practice or a retreat, because then I did start doing retreats at least once a year. Um, I don't know that I remember like a moment, when it happened, but I could just sense over time that it seemed like something was softening within me. And with that softening came greater spaciousness inside me for how I experienced myself, but also greater spaciousness even in the world, if that makes
Wow.
sense.
Yeah, and what a lovely description of the process of what was happening internally for you. Um, and then, were there any highlights for you in terms of looking back of your practice, in terms of
Hmm.
learning and development?
Yeah. It's so interesting you asking these questions because I really am appreciating now that for me, I think it has been a more gradual, at least in terms of what I experienced about myself and how my practice was changing who I was. The other thing that maybe was significant for me was when Shinzen started hinting to me that I could be a facilitator, what we called it back then, that maybe I could even do a home practice program as a facilitator. That was huge because I think experiencing his confidence, not just in me as a person, but his confidence in my progress and his confidence in my ability to speak about the practice and explain it to others. That was huge for me, especially because, as I said way back, I kind of had this view of myself that I didn't get it, that things were too abstract and I wasn't smart enough to understand all this stuff, let alone teach it to someone else. So I think the fact that someone I respected so much as a teacher, Shinzen, would even think that. And I have to admit, the first time he hinted at that, I said, "Well, can't you find anybody else to teach the program?" And of course, he laughed at that and said, "I'm asking you for a reason. I'm asking you because I do believe in you." I'm like, "Oh, okay." So I think once I started teaching, and we talk about this in unified mindfulness, that it's not only getting support, right? It's giving support. So I think the more I started offering myself as a mindfulness facilitator or a coach, that really accelerated things for me in my practice.
And I suppose having to explain to people, right, okay, how do I explain this to people in your own way and in your own words and, in your own metaphor? So would you say that you've had to kind of rethink of, okay, how I'm going to explain this to people in my group or to be able to say it in my own way?
Very, very much, because what I tend to do is I tend to get very enamored with how other people teach, whether it's Shinzen or someone like you, Bob, or some of our other colleagues that have studied unified mindfulness. When I hear other people teach, I just sometimes am blown away and I think, oh my gosh, they are saying it the perfect way. Like, that's exactly how I should say it. And I think for a while, maybe even with regard to Shinzen, maybe I was better at parroting what he said instead of integrating in myself what I was experiencing and then coming up with my own words. And that's been a long process for me to feel like I can really do that. I still have that pull every once in a while of like, oh, but so and so sounds so good when they teach and I should just sound like them. So I continue to say to myself, well, they are good and I'm not them and they aren't me and it's okay and I can do it the way I need to do it or want to do it. And
Yeah. Something you said that kind of made me think, that integrating piece where you really integrate that experience or that knowing somehow allows, would you say, allows that intuitive function, that wisdom functions to kind of process and, express itself?
I think you're exactly right that, and I don't know that it was an intentional experience, but I think in some ways, if there was time that I maybe didn't prepare as much as I thought I should, and have my script down about what I was going to say. And then I would be in a situation and then I would start noticing, like, wow, somehow I knew what to say. Where did that come from? Or somehow I knew how to answer that question, even though no one's ever asked me that specific question. Where did that come from that I could answer it? Maybe not in 100% perfect way, but in a acceptable, reasonable way, helpful way. So that really got me thinking, maybe this stuff has really soaked in at a cellular level and is not so much just files in my mind that I look for to look up this topic or this technique. And that's a great feeling when you start feeling you can trust that it's really there, kind of baked in.
Yeah. Um, so there's a few directions that I'm just wondering which where to go because one of the things you said, what you say, because one of the things that you're passionate about is communication.
Hmm.
Um, and I wonder if we could sort of explore that a bit more in terms of, what got you looking back interested in communication,
Hmm.
and then kind of pursuing that and dovetailing that with mindfulness practice.
Yes, 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 yes. You certainly know my love and my passion for communication. And in a nutshell, even though I maybe didn't use these words early in my life, I get them now that I see communication and conversation issues causing so much unnecessary suffering in people's lives. Either it's an unwillingness to speak, an unwillingness to listen, a fear of speaking about certain topics, a defensiveness that comes up in conversations. And I experienced this early on as a child. I think, like many people, my family, we were not the best communicators. So I even noticed as a young girl, like, why can't people just talk to each other, and work things out? And then fast forwarding when I got out of nursing school and became an oncology nurse. Again, this was in the 70s, where there was a lot of fear. Cancer was still considered a death sentence then, and there would be experiences I would have with patients and families where they would say, a family might say, oh, we don't want grandma to know that she has cancer because she couldn't handle it. Or we don't want the rest of the family to know that grandma has cancer. And while I respected what they were saying, I was just confused by it to say, it seems like this is something this family could be talking about and that it would help them. So I just tried on my own some different ways of facilitating conversations and then was able to get some additional training around that. And so that was really my first foray into, I think, what I now know as conversational coaching and facilitation.
And I think, that's, I would say that's also the case now as well in terms of medical professions, especially the more specialists,
Yes.
you know, they might have the medical skills, but they might not have the soft skills to be able to tell the patient or to be able to communicate across how severe or whether they might be looking at the end of life kind of
Yes.
conversations.
Yes, and even to make space for people
Mm.
to talk about their experiences around that,
Yeah.
I think it's still challenging for a lot of people unless they do have specific training around that and experience.
And people's assumptions, how you said that the family assume that, grandma doesn't, want to know that or is not able uh, to listen to. But has anybody actually asked grandma what she thinks and about the situation?
Exactly. Does anybody even talk to grandma, or do they just stand around her bed and talk about her instead of talking to her? So yeah, yeah.
So how did you go about training in terms of the communication piece? That sort of journey.
Yeah, well, little did I know at the time that even though I was very interested in that in working with cancer patients, I had no way of predicting that conversational coaching would be the through line through my whole career. And what I mean by that is I've never really had a job title called conversation facilitator, but every job that I had, because eventually I did leave healthcare and went into the corporate world, into financial services, and even as I did that, I felt like this interest and skill, I would say, around conversations, helping people have conversations that were hard, not always conflictual. Sometimes they were just topics that were complex or confusing, and people needed help unpacking those. So I just started getting as much training as I could, and the first coaching training that I took that really specialized in it was in the 90s. That looked at the ontology of language. In other words, how our use of language creates who we are. Sometimes using the quote that I know is pretty well known out there of we speak ourselves into the world, meaning the way we speak creates the world around us and creates us. And that was huge for me because that's the first time that I appreciated conversations as a truly creative and generative process. The conversations weren't just about explaining something that's already happened or even talking about something that should happen. What I started appreciating is I'm changing in every conversation I have. You and I right now, we won't be the same people exactly when we end this conversation. We're being changed by each other and what the dynamic is. Then I really, really fell in love with that whole idea of conversations being so creative and generative. So I just continued that, and when I left my corporate job, just continued on that track, taking as much training as I could take, reading as many books as I could, because by that time I was then very interested in combining my mindfulness practice with my love of conversations. And back then there wasn't a lot written about mindful communication. Now we've got scads of books on it. Um, but I just, I'm just one of those people that grabs everything that I can when there's something out there to read about how to integrate mindfulness and what I call conversational practice, because I think of both of them as practices in and of themselves. And then when you combine them, you really
Yeah.
got a winner.
Well, when you were talking about the creative aspects of conversation, that, as we're interacting now, it's not the same. It's changing. That
Hmm.
impermanence aspect, you can see the cross section of mindfulness and the conversations coming together there.
Yes, yes. And from an observational standpoint, oh my gosh, the mindfulness skills are so helpful because even in kind of basic communication skills, if we suggest that people be present or listen more effectively, I mean, that sounds great, right? But I don't think we really give them the skill to do it. And we certainly, up to now, have not really given them the skill to manage their own internal system, to notice. And even sometimes when we talk about approaching conversations in a non-judgmental way, I tweak that a little bit to say the judgments are going to happen. Like
Yeah,
it's sort of like trying not to think in meditation. Good luck.
yeah,
But if we could get quicker and more agile at noticing judgments and opinions and triggers that come up with us in conversation and find a way to equanimize those and make space for those, then we're so much less likely to be reactive. The old you can be responsive versus reactive. And I think that's a piece in communication skills of the past that's really been missing. And I think that's one of mindfulness's great contributions, managing the
yeah,
inner system in conversation.
yeah, definitely. And also when you said be present, have being able to explain to people, because a lot of people tend to hear these words, be present, be in the now. What do they actually mean? What's that experience? What do you mean by that? And having to go through um, explaining and understanding what those mean rather than just a word that's kind of bounced about.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Well, again, taking directly from our unified mindfulness vocabulary and dictionary, um, I when I talk about presence, I do like using the idea of can I track real time in the moment what's happening inside me, my thoughts, my feelings, etc. But can I also pay attention to what's happening around me? And if I can learn to do that, if I can bring myself to that moment, and of course, in unified mindfulness, it's so great because we use the physical senses, right? See, hear, feel.
Yeah.
So, what I always remind people is if you lean on those physical sensory experiences, what am I seeing? What am I hearing? What am I feeling? That immediately brings you into the now because those things aren't happening in the past and they're not happening in the future. What I'm seeing, hearing, and feeling is happening now. So I think that is an easy way for people to experience presence as something they can do and call upon at any time without it sounding like a weird kind of mystical state that I need to get into.
It makes it more tangible, doesn't it? Rather than
Mhm.
some kind of airy fairy thing.
Yes.
Yes.
The other big thing that I do when I coach around presence is make sure people know that it'll be more of a flow, right? More of a rhythm that we develop. In other words, some people think that being present would mean that I would, you know, not blink and keep my eyes on you. It's like, okay, Bob, I'm present, I'm
You're
present, I'm
scaring me
present.
there, Chris.
Exactly. Exactly. So we don't want people to do that, but helping people understand the rhythm of sometimes I am a little bit more removed in the conversation and sometimes I'm pulled in and sometimes I go out and sometimes I come in. So my presence is dynamic in the conversation as well as our sense of connection. Same
Yeah.
thing that if we talk about connecting in a conversation, I think it's crazy to believe that we're going to stay connected 100% of the time in a conversation. Even in a fun conversation, we have times that we get more self-focused. And that's okay. So, what I try to help people understand is notice what your rhythm is and notice when you get off that rhythm. If all of a sudden the focus is too much on self to the point that you've stopped listening. So, or too much on what the other's saying that you're not paying attention a little bit to what's happening in your own internal system that would be influencing your responses.
Yeah. And was that kind of the evolution of your um, kind of playing with the conversation and the mindfulness kind of develop um, where you are today?
Yes, yeah, I would definitely say that those things helped. And it's funny because when I went off on my own as an independent coach and facilitator, I I felt like I had to keep those two things separate. Conversations on one side and mindfulness on another side. This was 10, 15 years ago, and um, part of that was because I work with business clients. I work with a lot of business clients as well as individuals, as well as doing couples or dyad coaching, in any kind of partnerships. Um, but for my business clients back then, again, we're talking like, 8, 10 years ago, they would, if they knew that I was into mindfulness, they would be a little bit nervous, like if they were hiring me to do a meeting facilitation and say things like, you're not going to have us come in and start chanting Om or something like that, are you? Because we don't think that would really be good for our leadership team. Of course, part of me wanted to say, you probably should be chanting Om more because that would probably help you. But I would need to reassure them of, no, I'm not going to have you practice Om and that sort of thing. So I would have to be kind of stealthy, in
Okay.
how I
Yeah.
introduced some mindfulness concepts. And part of what's made me so happy and excited in these last few years is that now, as you know, there's so much more acceptance in the world of business and in the professional, different professions for mindfulness and how it can work. So much so that a couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to work with a leadership team, and they literally asked me to focus a 5 hour online retreat on mindfulness.
Wow.
I'm like, wow, that's a big shift, versus the old days of you're not going to bring that mindfulness stuff in here, are you? So,
And you must have seen, the benefits you've been able to share, practice and conversations to people where it changes their lives. Those lovely moments where wow, I've done something good here, where somebody has benefited from, you know.
yeah, yeah. I am continually just heartened and humbled by the feedback people give, particularly around people who come in to a coaching thinking that it truly is impossible, like a certain conversation with a certain person around a certain topic, when they assess it as impossible. Impossible. I've tried this before. It hasn't worked. This person won't listen to me. Those are some of my favorite examples to help people with that. And whether they use me as a facilitator to have that conversation, which they oftentimes will do, sometimes that comes up in a funny way when I'm coaching them, and then they'll pause and they'll say, "How about you just have this conversation for me?" And I'll say, "Well, I don't think that's going to work, but if you want, I can do it with you if you think that will help." So that's sort of how I got into doing a lot more conversation facilitation between two people. Um, but it's so gratifying when people say, I never imagined that I'd be able to speak up the way that I did. I never believed that person would listen to me. Or I never believed I'd be able to take that kind of feedback and not get so defensive and so reactive. That happens a lot in the business world. And I think, speaking of the business world, I do think that's one of the best uses for mindful communication is certainly giving feedback. But there's a lot of classes on giving feedback. Where I think we have maybe missed the mark is we don't give enough help in receiving feedback. That's tough. And you know from a lot of the training we've done, when we get a lot of feedback, I think there's a skill to receiving feedback from people.
So, Chris, what you were saying just now, the words that come to mind is as if you've helped these individuals to have a voice, to be able to say what they really wanted to say.
Yes, that's what feels really, or one of the most gratifying things to me is when they report that. Or I guess the other thing that is, back to what I said about how my own experience with mindfulness has created more space within me and around me. I think that's the other thing. While clients don't often use that word, space, what they describe is feeling less contracted, less claustrophobic when it comes to talking to people, like more able to relax and trust what they have to say. And that, I guess, like you asked me about the wisdom function in my own experience, that maybe at some level they can trust
Mhm.
that they know what's in their heart to say. And maybe they still say it a little clumsily, but with the right intent and with the right tone, it can still make a big difference. So I like that too, where people feel like they have, well, even the name of my business is actually Another Possibility. And that came directly out of the feedback I got from people, because when I asked them, what do you feel like you've gained after you've worked with me? And they always said, more choice, more possibility, more options, more space. So that's really what inspired my business name, is because I just heard that over and over and over again for people.
And what a lovely name, Another
Mm.
Possibility. where there are potential doors and avenues people can explore
Mhm.
to improve their lives. Beautiful.
Exactly.
And how do you, when you have these sessions with people, how do you go about the influence of your practice to be able to use that in these sessions? Is there something that
Yeah.
you do?
Yeah, it depends on, it's funny when I was talking before about keeping conversations and mindfulness kind of separate way back when. And now it's funny because I will have people come to me because I also do mindfulness coaching. People come to me saying, I want to learn about mindfulness, and we'll do a few things and teach some techniques and that sort of thing. But but sooner or later they'll come and say, really, what's got me stressed out today is I have to go have a conversation with my boss, or I have this conflict with a coworker. So can we use mindfulness to help me with that? It's like, yeah, we can. So all of a sudden, their mindfulness, what we started with mindfulness, has now kind of mushroomed into conversations. And the opposite obviously is true, that they may come in saying, I need to prepare to have a conversation with whoever, my spouse. And as I'm talking to them, I can tell obviously that they're very keyed up and nervous and all those things. So I'll say, well, before you even open your mouth to your spouse, we need to do some work on you.
Yeah.
And sometimes I call it the inner work. We need to do the inner work, managing our own system, as well as the outer work. We need to know, what to say and how to say it and when to say it. A lot of my conversation coaching clients come in wanting the outer work. Just tell me what to say. Just tell me what I should do in the situation. And I'll say, I'm happy to help you with that. But before we do that, let's check in what's happening with you. And even if I don't, again, orchestrate it as, let me now teach you mindfulness, even if we do a little bit of see, hear, feel, or some of our techniques that we do in unified mindfulness, it's enough to get them intrigued and enough to get them to experience some benefit that they'll say, maybe I should do that kind of thing more. Like, yeah, let's talk about that. So it's been fun to see how the two have fed into each other. Um, so sometimes, again, the teaching around mindfulness and the coaching is more explicit and relies on specific techniques, and other times it's more, sort of like just paying attention to what's going on, and I don't saddle them with a bunch of terminology and things like that.
Um, but in terms of when you're having these like conversation coaching, um, where you've got two people working together, do you practice something? Do you have some sort of strategies or things that you're doing whilst you're kind of helping? So I'm talking about your own practice. Do you have some sort of practice or something that you keep track of or be more aware of to kind of manage the conversations, etc.?
In the conversation itself,
Yes,
you're
yeah,
asking. Yeah,
yes,
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, well, that's where it's so helpful. Again, if people know this, in our unified mindfulness practice, we have those micro hits where you can quickly, in a matter of just a few seconds or a few minutes, implement a technique. And so I use those a lot, depending upon what's going on in the moment. Sometimes I need to do a micro hit of feel rest to
yeah,
just get my own body, because I'll notice, especially if things are getting intense, I'll notice my own shoulders kind of coming up and my face starting to clench. So I can do a micro hit of feel rest. Also, background practice. Where most of my attention, maybe 80%, is on what I'm doing in the conversation, but 20% is on a practice. Typically, for those, I also use feel rest
okay,
or feel good.
yeah,
I do find, for me, since conversations take up a lot of mental space, the body tends to be the easiest place for me to access when I'm facilitating conversations, because there's already too much that I'm managing in my head. And what am I going to say? And what is this person saying? So I definitely trust the body. If I just take a minute to go to the body or use background practice with the body, is
Yeah.
a big, big help. And, I think we know this, that so much of our whole state is influenced by what this body is doing, what this body is feeling. So just taking a moment to notice that and
Mhm.
meet that, it's huge.
Thanks for sharing those, Chris. Um, and at at the start, you mentioned about the unified mindfulness practices, and there's so much in that. So, is there something you're particularly interested in now in terms of your own practice and development? Just wondering what you could share, from your own practice.
Yeah, it changes from time to time, as I'm sure is true for everyone. But most recently, the thing I've been enjoying a lot, and I did this a while ago. I actually even taught a home practice program on it several years ago on balancing effort and ease. And then Shinzen did a retreat, just like a 4 hour retreat several months ago through some other organization. And that's what he did. He balanced effort with ease. So, in other words, the effortful part of the practice is see, hear, feel everything,
Yeah,
like note everything, like really keep your attention on all that's going on. And then drop into do nothing, which is doing nothing, like letting go of your attention to control anything about your attention. And what I appreciated about how he did this half day retreat was that we only had 10-minute meditation periods that we would rotate with. So it's not like we'd do a whole, hour or couple hours on see, hear, feel and a couple hours on do nothing.
yeah,
It was that cycling back and forth every 10 minutes that blew me away. So ever since then, I've been kind of really intrigued by that. And even when I sit down to practice, if I think I'm going to practice something else, I feel like I get pulled into that contrasting experience of being present with all of it and then letting it go.
yeah.
Being present with everything, letting it go. And I love that. And going back to what you said about the practicing mindfulness even in conversational facilitation, I can see where that's really benefiting me because sometimes in facilitation there's a lot of efforting,
Yeah.
but then I try to find those moments, those micro hits of do nothing, let it go, let it go, let it go. So
When you said he was alternating between efforting and ease, what particular in particular blew you away?
I think how relatively easy it was to drop my intention to control my attention. Now, I've been practicing with him for 15
Yeah,
years, so I wasn't a newbie to that
yeah,
practice. And I know sometimes that's kind of a strange practice because there's not a lot of instructions to it. But I noticed that in years past, I tended to avoid the do nothing technique. I wasn't resistant to it. I just never felt drawn to it that much.
yeah,
But there was something about the contrast, and I think it was that. I think it was noticing and developing confidence in my ability to be able to do that. As Shinzen says, on a dime, right?
yeah, yeah,
It's like, wow. And the reverse is true also. How could I go from this do nothing state
yeah,
to all of a sudden be aware of everything going on around me? So I think something about that, kind of like circuit training or whatever was, and there was something too, I think about how quickly we did it. As I said, the 10
yeah,
minutes, um, because you notice those transitions more quickly. It's not
yeah,
like you eased into it.
yeah.
It's like you're over here, and then you're over here, then you're over here, then you're over here.
So do you think with that quick transitions, just occurring in mind, that that helped with noticing clearer when you were efforting and when you were at ease, and that clarity kind of make a notice, oh, I am doing this, and I don't know, that was what kind of came through.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there was something about that quick transition that that and being guided to do that. Now, I don't know if I would have done that as well, if it would have been as powerful. As a matter of fact, I don't. That's a really good question because uh, I'm pleased that I have a recording of Shinzen from that program.
Yeah.
So I keep listening to him. It's like I've tried to do it on my own a few times, and I'm not as disciplined to do the 10 minute and then the shift. But when I listen to his voice and then I hear the bell ring, right? I can I can do it. So um, yeah, it's pretty interesting. Although I think on the recording I listen to some that are a little bit longer than the 10 minutes, but nevertheless, it's just really something really revealing for me in doing that. So that's been my latest favorite thing.
Well, thank you very much, Chris, for sharing, and being, for me to interview you. Um, could we end with just a micro hit, one of your favorite practice, um, for to end the session? Would that
Yeah,
be okay?
to actually do the micro hit or
Yeah.
talk about it.
No, no,
Do the
no.
micro
To
hit.
end, yeah, yeah. So we'll end the session with you leading us to a micro hit.
All right, all right. Well, I already mentioned feel rest is one of my favorites, and
Okay,
one of the places I like to go is the hands, which tend to have emotional neutrality. So let's
okay,
do that. So take
okay.
a moment to put your attention on your hands, noticing that they're relatively neutral from the standpoint of emotionality. They may still have physical sensation, temperature of the skin, or even a tingling in the fingers. But just check for yourself the degree of emotionality present. And perhaps you notice a sense of rest, emotional rest, peace. And if so, just appreciate that for a moment. Okay, good. Good. Well, that's a micro hit.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. It's always a pleasure speaking to you. And
Mm.
bye,
Thanks for
everybody.
your great questions. I learned a lot from your questions, so thank you.